Welcome, everyone. This is our monthly nature talk occurring the first Tuesday of every month. Thank you so much for coming. We're very lucky to have Dr. Charles Bangley here with us today. He's currently a research associate on the math and statistics and biology departments at Dalhousie University, where he works on translating tag detections into models for predicting the distribution of fish species. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology at the University of Rhode Island. Before coming to Halifax in 2020, he was a postdoc at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. He's long been interested in the habitat use and movement ecology of highly migratory marine species with a focus on coastal sharks. Most of his work combines tracking and environmental data to learn more about where animals are and why they occur there. So he's going to be discussing the world of sharks and rays in Nova Scotia. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Charles.
So can everybody see this?
I can see it perfect.
Fantastic. All right. Oh, thanks to Jess and Nature Nova Scotia for having me here. Here to talk about I'm very biased, but I think this is in my opinion some of the cooler resonance of Nova Scotia's ecosystems here, which are the sharks and rays. And I'm just going to hop right into it. So yeah, a little bit further about my background. Went to University of Rhode Island, majored in marine biology, been an ocean nerd for a very long time. Worked while I was at East Carolina, getting my master's of science and PhD. For the master's thesis, I worked on spiny dogfish feeding habits and habitat use off North Carolina, which proceeded to make that my absolute favorite species. And then for my PhD, I worked on the bigger coastal shark community. So dogfish were still in the mix, but looking at what other species might occur in North Carolina estuaries and how they were using those habitats and moving around in them. From there, I took that whole shark tracking idea kind of coastwide with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, working as part of the Smithsonian Movement of Life initiative. We were trying to characterize movement and identify important habitats for 5 different shark species and 1 ray that were all based in the U.S. Mid-Atlantic region, so around the kind of Chesapeake Bay, Delaware Bay, up to southern New England area. And then finally here at Dalhousie, I'm working on translating all of these tag detection data, matching them up with environmental data and trying to use them to make predictive models of when fish species, including a couple of shark species, might be in Minas Passage, and just working with a tremendous variety of people there. Including the Fundy Ocean Research Center for Energy, the Ocean Tracking Network, the Mi'kmaq Conservation Group at Katy University, and local fishers. So enough about me. You're here to hear about sharks. So sharks is often used, or the term sharks is often used as kind of a catch-all term for fish with cartilaginous skeletons. So what that means is they basically have skeletons that are made out of the same material that gives structure to our noses and our earlobes, essentially. So it's a lot more flexible and a lot less dense than bone, but it can be fairly dense. I mean, shark teeth are known for being really sturdy and really sharp, and are also a form of cartilage. But sharks are not the only fish with cartilaginous skeletons. There are also the chimeras, known as the holocephali. I won't talk about them too much in this presentation. There are a few species that might occur in Nova Scotia waters, but they're mostly very far out and very deep. And then we have the batoidea, the batoids, which are the rays and skates, which we do have here in Nova Scotia, especially represented by the skates. And then finally, the selachii, or the sharks, which everybody knows and loves due to their shark-like appearance. So there are a few different pieces of the anatomy that we just want to talk about because we use these to identify different species. So things like the mouth, the shape of the teeth, the position of the eye relative to the mouth, that can be important in identifying species. Some have a spiracle behind the eyes, which is actually kind of an extra gill on the top of the head. You see this particularly in species that spend a lot of time laying on the bottom. The gill openings, most sharks have 5 gill openings. Some have 6 or 7, and they are creatively named the 6 and 7 gill sharks. But that's a way to tell sharks apart from other fish. Most fishes have a gill covering, where sharks have these slits basically that allow water flow through. There are usually two dorsal fins on sharks. Some of them have just one. Sometimes they have dorsal fin spines. At least one species that's very prevalent here in Nova Scotia water. So we'll have dorsal spines. The pectoral fins are along the side. You have the pelvic fins. You can tell male and female sharks apart by whether or not there are claspers present, which are an extra kind of extension of the pelvic fin on the males. And then finally, you have the anal fin, the caudal fin, and some of the more fast-moving species actually have a keel that comes out alongside the caudal fin. So sharks have been around for a very long time. Cartilaginous fishes in general go as far back as basically things with bones and jaws. So the first cartilaginous fishes started showing up back in the Silurian and Ordovician periods, really expanded out during the Devonian. But basically, there are the first ancestors of sharks kind of predated any kind of vertebrate being on land. The very first ones predate trees. So yeah, the very first shark ancestors have been around since before any kind of land vertebrates actually made their way onto land. The earliest ancestors predate trees. So this group of animals has been around for a very, very long time, and has mostly just kind of stayed in the ocean. So as we look at the evolution of true sharks, not just cartilaginous fishes in general, we see the chimeras split off pretty early on, had quite a bit of diversity in some earlier times, and then have kind of expanded back out since then. And then around the Permian to Triassic period, that's when we start seeing the family lineages that would bring up our modern sharks, rays, and skates. This figure is a little bit outdated. There's actually some evidence now that rays actually kind of split off from sharks relatively early and kind of evolved in parallel with them. But in general, we would recognize animals that were around in the Triassic period, which was the first part of the age of dinosaurs. There were things swimming around that would be very easily recognizable as sharks that would look very similar to animals that we have swimming in our oceans today. So they kind of hit on the right kind of body plan to be a big marine predator early on, and just kind of got better at it as time went on. They also have a variety of life histories and reproductive modes. In general, most sharks and rays are long-lived, slow-growing, and late maturing, which can create issues from a conservation standpoint, because they tend to have to live at least about 5 to 10 years before they can reproduce themselves. They grow relatively slow, but on the flip side, they're very long lived. Some species can actually be up to a century old, possibly more. They're very easy to impact with fishing pressure, with habitat destruction, with all of those kind of pressures that human beings can put on animals. All sharks and rays reproduce using internal fertilization, which means they actually have to mate. They don't just kind of fire off eggs and sperm into the water like a lot of bony fish do. And they have three major modes of reproduction. The first is oviparity, or egg laying. And an interesting thing about the shark and ray family is that they show every type of reproduction that you see in other vertebrates. So some of them lay eggs like birds and reptiles and amphibians do, in which case the embryo develops in a protective egg case, which you may have seen washed up on the beach in the form of a mermaid's purse. Skates are well known for this. Chimeras also lay a really interesting kind of teardrop shaped egg. And then cat sharks and horn sharks also lay eggs and attach them to the bottom. Usually there are little filaments attached to the eggs that will allow it to latch on to a piece of algae or a piece of structure on the bottom and stay in place. And in the case of the horn sharks, they actually lay these really interesting corkscrew shaped eggs that have evolved to kind of wedge their way in between rocks and be really hard to pry out. So some sharks lay eggs. Sharks are also well known for giving live birth, and they actually have a few different ways of doing this. The first is aplacental or yolk sac viviparity. Viviparity basically means live birth. As opposed to being hatched out of an egg that was laid by the mother, they're carried around in the mother until they're a fully formed little miniature shark or ray and ready to swim around and take care of themselves. In the case of yolk sac viviparity, the eggs hatch within the mother, and the embryos are fed by that yolk sac, like you see attached to this little spiny dogfish. as they develop. So they derive all their nutrients from that attached egg yolk. So a lot of rays reproduce this way. The dogfish sharks reproduce this way. Carpet sharks, including whale sharks, and also tiger sharks use this form of reproduction. There is, however, a slightly more extreme version of yolk sac viviparity, in which the juveniles will absorb the yolk, but then be provided with extra unfertilized eggs by the mother to kind of feed on as they continue to develop. This usually gives them the advantage of being born quite a bit larger than some of the other shark species. So this is referred to as oophagy, which is basically Latin for egg eating. So some of the groups that do this include the mackerel sharks, which include species like the white shark, the mako, the porbeagle, as well as the thresher sharks. And then there's a very extreme version of this that is utilized by the sand tiger sharks, in which they don't just eat, their own yolk sac and then extra unfertilized eggs. They also eat their other siblings. So in sand tigers, the only pups that end up getting born are the two absolute largest of the juveniles that have been carried around by the mother. And actually, sand tigers are, despite that, a very kind of docile species around humans. So they probably get a lot of their aggression out before they're even born. And then finally, we have what's called placental viviparity. So this is actually interestingly close to the way that mammals develop inside their mothers. So in this case, the embryo, the developing pup inside the mother, is directly connected to the mother through a basically umbilical cord. So it's kind of evolved from kind of the same material that the yolk sac would have been derived from in some of the other species, but it's at some point evolved an attachment to the mother. The mother supplies them directly with nutrients and nourishment, and then when it's time to be born, they break off of the umbilical cord and actually have a little umbilical scar between the pectoral fins. You can see that in this little lemon shark that's in the process of swimming away from mom there. So you can actually tell a very fresh newborn shark in these families by the presence of this little basically belly button that it carries around for the first few months of its life. So the families that do this include the smooth hounds, which includes the smooth dogfish, the cartilaginous sharks, which includes things like this lemon shark shown here, but also blue sharks, black tips, bull sharks, a lot of your kind of classic sharks. And then the hammerheads also use this form of reproduction. Fun fact about the hammerheads, their heads are actually soft until they're born, so those big wide eye stalks don't get stuck on the way out. Sharks also fill a lot of important ecological roles, and probably the best understood ecological role is their role as predators in the ocean. However, not all sharks are these big adult apex predator sharks. And even the apex predator sharks are not necessarily on the top of the food web when they're juveniles. But we classically think of sharks as being things like the big tiger sharks, the white sharks, the bulls, these 10-foot plus long animals that are kind of terrorizing everything else in the ecosystem. However, most sharks and pretty much all rays would actually fall in the mid-level area of the marine food web. That's occupied by things like large fish, by marine mammals, things that are themselves predators, but could also themselves be prey to the real apex predators. Through a lot of careful observation and through a lot of experimental manipulations out in the field, it's actually been found that these big apex predator sharks actually play a role in structuring the whole marine ecosystem in areas where they occur. So in the very appropriately named Shark Bay, Australia, the seasonal presence of tiger sharks actually changes the behavior of all the kind of lower level predators and herbivores like sea turtles. So they're all kind of going into different areas of habitat where they're less likely to be ambushed by these big tiger sharks. And what's actually been found is that by things like the turtles moving around, this actually affects areas of seagrass growth. And they found a higher diversity and longer blade length of seagrass growing in areas where basically the turtles are afraid of the tiger sharks, and they're concentrating more on looking over their shoulders for those sharks than kind of grazing on the seagrass. This in turn makes that a better habitat for things like juvenile fish that take shelter in seagrass, with the extra benefit that those mesopredators like dolphins and larger fish are probably going to be scared to go into the same areas as the turtles. So in this way, we can actually see these kind of trickle down effects from these the presence of these sharks. An apex predator can be relative as well. When you're up in an estuary, sometimes a small shark is all the predator you need. A really interesting thing about the sharks in particular, although there are a lot of rays that are also highly migratory, is that these animals are capable of really, really long migrations and just really long movements. In some cases, going to places that we can't quite explain. But in general, these huge, highly migratory species are limited really only by kind of intangible environmental features. So their features, they're not like land animals that get blocked up by, say, a river or a mountain range or something like that. The only thing really stopping a large shark from moving around is where its preferred temperature ranges are, where the food's available. Some species don't necessarily like to go over the continental shelf. And it turns out that these same kind of features are actually used to describe ecoregions in the ocean. You can almost think of them as kind of provinces in the ocean that each have their own kind of unique character, unique set of animals living in them. And that's because all of the animals living in them are adapted to the conditions in those areas. But again, those areas are kind of influenced by landforms and kind of geographic features, but they're really defined by things that can vary quite a bit in the marine environment. So the kind of major ecoregions of interest and relevance to us here in Nova Scotia, starting from right here, the one we're actually in, the Scotian Shelf ecoregion. So Halifax sits right smack in the middle of this one. And it extends from Cape Breton down to Cape Sable. So from Cape Breton all the way down the South Shore, basically. And that's characterized by fairly cold water. We get the occasional eddy coming up from the Gulf Stream current, so warmer water does come in. This part of Nova Scotia is also very exposed to the Atlantic Ocean in general. So things like warming trends and seasonal trends that are happening in the ocean are going to be very reflected here. The next ecoregion that kind of comes up around behind Nova Scotia is the Gulf of Maine and Bay of Fundy ecoregion. So this area is a little bit colder. It's a little bit less likely to be altered by what's going on outside in the Atlantic Ocean. It also has the extra quirk of hosting the Bay of Fundy's extreme tides. So species you see in this area tend to be really adapted to kind of very changing conditions and kind of adapted to take use of those extreme tides and the habitat that they can provide. Next, we have the Virginian ecoregion, which extends from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, down to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. And this is the region I kind of worked in while I was at the Smithsonian. It's a very temperate region. The water temperatures are very defined by what season it is, so it can be very warm in the summer and pretty cold in the winter, though not nearly as cold as it gets up here in Nova Scotia. And then finally, south of Cape Hatteras, going down to Cape Canaveral, Florida, you have the Carolinian region. And this is where things are really warm. The Gulf Stream coming up along the side of Florida is really close to the shoreline here, and it kind of gets deflected off by Cape Hatteras. So this is where you get a lot of your warmer water species. This is the kind of core habitat area for things like tiger sharks, bull sharks, great hammerheads, some of those big charismatic warm water species. But theoretically, should one of those kind of red patches of water there that basically illustrate warm water end up kind of blowing in off of Halifax, there wouldn't actually be that much stopping a shark from the Mid-Atlantic region or the Carolinian region from coming up here. When thinking about migration and habitat use and really what sharks are doing in general, I actually like to use the model that Matt Hooper, who's the marine biologist in Jaws, describes. He says sharks are really a miracle of evolution. All they do is swim and eat and make little sharks. And we obviously know that shark behavior is a lot more complex than that these days, but it is actually a really useful way to think about different types of shark habitat. So sharks are swimming around. We've already demonstrated that they're really highly migratory. They cover these huge distances, and they need a safe habitat to travel through. They need those ocean highways to make those areas accessible. So they have their migratory routes are basically the swimming habitat. And then there's foraging habitat. Eating is probably one of the things that sharks are best known for. And areas where prey is abundant, they will tend to slow down and spend extended periods of time in there. And then finally, there's the making little sharks, which is nursery habitat. Sharks aren't born 10 feet long. They don't start out as full-on apex predators. So they need habitats where they can grow up in relative safety and with a lot of food availability, but also kind of stay away from some of the adults and some of the other larger shark species. Each of these types of habitat would be classified as central fish habitat. And I'm kind of exposing my Americanness here because that's a designation, but for the used by the National Marine Fisheries Service in the US. But it's basically habitat required to complete the life cycle of an animal. So any one of these habitats could be crucial to a shark living long enough to reproduce itself and basically make little sharks to start the cycle over again. Another interesting thing is being long-lived. These animals have a long time to pick up different behaviors and a long time to kind of interact with each other and avoid interacting with each other. So you'll often see habitat use and migratory extent differ by life stage and sex. So the juveniles will be probably occupying less space than the adults, although you do have some species where the juveniles actually range out farther. The males and females oftentimes occupy different habitats as well. So how do we study all this stuff? There are a few different methods. I'm just going to go through the ones that I've been personally involved in. But one way to get an idea is through things like fishery independent surveys, using standardized kind of scientific versions of literal fishing gear to go around and periodically sample a marine environment. So what you see on the left is us using a scientifically standardized gill net to look for juvenile sharks in the Cape Fear River of North Carolina. On the right is a full map of Pamlico Sound, North Carolina, and all of the sites that have been covered by two different types of surveys run there by the state fisheries agency. They're obviously not sampling all of those like several hundred locations every single year, but what they'll do is they'll randomly pick locations out of potential spots. And over the course of a long investment in time, they will build up a database that essentially covers most of the available environment that they're interested in. So these are, once they're standardized and set up, they can actually produce a tremendous amount of data. These are great for noticing, especially changes in the ecosystem. They're great for picking up things like seasonal presence of different species. They can be relatively expensive to maintain, and sometimes they require years of effort before you can start to pick out trends. It's a general rule that you oftentimes need to run these things for at least a decade before you can start to notice real differences between years and real changes that are occurring over multiple years. However, these can be a really nice way if you have the resources to monitor a specific environment. There's also traditional mark recapture. And this is a method that was really introduced in the 1960s and 70s by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the US. DFO also makes use of this methodology here in Canada. And the idea is you catch a shark, you attach a tag to the base of the dorsal fin that has a unique ID number. You log the location, the date, and the time that you caught and released that shark. And then at some point, that shark gets captured again. And maybe the person finds the tag, reports it in, gives the location that the shark was caught. Sometimes you get extra information like the size of the shark when it was caught and see if it grew between when you originally tagged it and when it was recaptured. So over the course of tagging really just thousands of individual sharks, these type of projects have been able to put together these tremendous data sets that are providing a really, really huge amount of information on just how far these sharks can go. You can get seasonal trends, like figuring out what time of year these sharks are being caught in different parts of the ocean. And you can look at connectivity between different parts of the ocean as well. In the case of this blue shark data set shown here, you can actually look at connectivity between entire continents. So before people started really using these methods, we were really unsure just how far these sharks were going. And it turns out in the case of blue sharks, very far. These programs are still going, and they're actually a great example of kind of a successful project in which researchers and fishermen are working together. Fishers can volunteer to be part of this tagging program, and then they're sent a set of tags and basically told to opportunistically tag a shark when they see it. So a lot of really cool information has come out of this, not just about migration, but also about things like growth rates, about differences in habitat use between males and females, just all kinds of stuff. And a lot of the more kind of what we think of as tagging these days actually derives from those mark recapture methods. We're basically just trying to find fancier ways to get more information out of sticking something on a shark and getting its location. So one method that's really well known now is the smart position or temperature tag. So these are the dorsal fin mounted electronic tags. When the shark comes to the surface, the antenna makes a connection with the Argos satellite network, basically produces a ping to the satellite that then can get recorded in real time. So things like the OSERT shark tracker, that's the technology that's behind that. So you could actually download that app, see real-time or relatively close to real-time shark detections that are coming from these satellite tags. There are some trade-offs to this. The tags, as you might expect themselves, are fairly expensive. You really want to pay attention to things like animal welfare when you're sticking something potentially this bulky to an animal. You want to make sure it's small enough that it's not really going to affect the animal much. And it does require the tagged animal to surface often, which for things like great whites, makos, blue sharks is actually turning out to happen fairly often. These are big open ocean sharks. They tend to come up and kind of bask in the sun to warm themselves up fairly often. But other species, like some of the hammerheads, like bull sharks, tend to stay down deep. So you can literally sometimes go weeks to months before you get another ping. So when you're dealing with, when you're trying to figure out how you want to track sharks, you really want to think about which species you're dealing with and how they act. There are also pop-off satellite tags. These are attached to the animal kind of in the same way as those traditional mark recapture tags where they're just darted in. And they're programmed to pop off after a set amount of time, usually a relatively short set amount of time. So you're looking at usually you're trying to answer short-term questions about things like diving behavior, how well the animal is doing and acting after it's been kind of caught and released, that kind of stuff. But you can get really good detailed environmental data from these tags. They have a variety of sensors they can carry. You get really detailed vertical dive profiles, so you can actually see the animal kind of sticking around near the surface during part of the day and then diving really deep during another part of the day. The trade-off is they use a kind of complicated way to tell where the animal is in terms of latitude and longitude. So you get this great vertical data, but latitude and longitude is actually estimated by a light sensor on the tag that figures out the angle the sun is hitting, and then estimates the animal's position on the earth from that. So as you can imagine, that's got quite a bit of error around it, and sometimes the latitude longitude positions can have areas of error around them that can be like on the spectrum of like dozens to hundreds of kilometers. But it's a useful, depending on what kind of question you're trying to ask, if you want to know more about the dive profiles, if you want to know what kind of temperatures the animal's encountering, that kind of stuff, this is a great little technology to get. Another important consideration is that when this tag pops off, it will try to transmit as much of the data as it has stored before the battery runs out to satellites, so you can download it from there. However, if you really want to get all the data, you need to get this tag back, which is why sometimes on social media, you'll see shark researchers posting that they had a tag that was transmitting its position that might have washed up on a beach, and they'll kind of try to enlist people's help to get that tag back. So if you see one of those alerts in your local area, help your local elasmobranchsa researchers out. The technology that I probably use the most is acoustic telemetry. So in this case, you need two pieces of equipment. You need the transmitter that you attach to the animal. It can either be attached externally on on like a dart tag kind of situation, or kind of attached to the animal in the way that you'd almost attach a spot tag, or it can actually be surgically implanted into the animal as well, if you want to make sure it's not kind of adding any extra drag to the external part of it. The transmitter transmits a unique ID code. And then in order to actually pick up those pings, you need acoustic receivers kind of strategically placed in the water to actually pick up and translate those signals. So what you'll end up on those receivers is basically a big spreadsheet of dates, times, tag IDs, and maybe some other data, depending on what kind of sensors are on the tag. So this is kind of preferable in some cases to things like satellite tagging, because you don't need the animal to surface. But there is a little bit of extra complication added in the fact that you do need receivers to be in the water, kind of where you'd expect the animal to go. However, there's recently researchers have gotten around this by forming collaborative receiver networks, like the Ocean Tracking Network right here in Nova Scotia, as well as the Atlantic Cooperative Telemetry Network, the FACT Network based down in Florida. There are also regional networks around Australia, South Africa, the Gulf of Mexico. They're setting them up on the Pacific coast. And what these allow researchers to do is to actually share tag detections data. So you put your tagged fish out there, it swims out of the area that you have your own receivers, but it gets picked up on somebody else's receivers. They can upload that data to these networks. And then you end up getting your tag detections. You end up learning a whole lot about the animal from this. You're learning, areas that it went that you might not have expected when you started your study. And it also inherently allows for collaboration between people, allows for communication. And you get a whole lot of cool project ideas and just meet some interesting folks doing this. So this has allowed acoustic telemetry to reach a point where it can get that kind of coast-wide coverage that you could previously only achieve by doing things like satellite telemetry. But the trade-off is that receivers do have to be there. Even in these big networks, you're still kind of dependent on where everybody in the network decided to put their own receivers. So all tagging technologies, basically, as a takeaway from this whole section, all tagging technologies kind of have their trade-offs, and it's important to know that when you're analyzing the data. You can also do things like species distribution modeling, where you take those tag detections, you match them up with environmental data, and you start to get an idea of what the environmental conditions were where your animal was, and perhaps often as importantly, where your animal was not. So you can get information like, I was picking up tag detections on these receivers when the water temperature was above 17 degrees Celsius, but not when it was below it, and not when it was above 25 degrees Celsius. So you can kind of match different types of data up like that, and actually start to get an idea of these relationships between when your animal is in a certain area and when it's not. And from there, you can actually start putting together these predictive models where if all you know is the environmental conditions, you could get a reasonable, basically educated guess as to how likely your species is to be present. So I like to call this fish forecasting. It's basically the outputs look very similar to what you get from like a weather forecast. So all the way on the right there, that's actually the darker the blue, the more likely that a dusky shark is to be in the area. And that's based on looking at actual tag detections of dusky sharks and seeing what things like the temperature, the depth, the salinity levels, chlorophyll A is the amount of phytoplankton in the water. So getting an idea of what the conditions were when those sharks were present and when they were not. And we can start to actually make predictions on where they might be. This is getting especially important as climate change is doing things like shifting species distributions. So why study migration and habitat use? You can identify important habitat areas and migratory routes. This is especially important for species that are of conservation concern, that may have closed areas that are intended to protect certain life stages. Some shark species have time area closures for certain types of fishing gear in certain areas of the coast, and that's designed to protect juveniles of those species so they can grow to become adults. But things like tracking technologies and generally studying migration and habitat use can tell you how well those protected areas are working. You can also look at how often these movements are overlapping with fisheries, other species. You can, again, measure the effectiveness of closed areas. And you can also determine whether or not distribution and habitat use have been changing. So the figure there is from kind of an accidental discovery we made while I was working in North Carolina, where we saw that temperatures were rising in Pamlico Sound, and we saw in some of these survey data that juvenile bull sharks suddenly started showing up during certain years, and then after about 2009, 2010, you started seeing them often, and we actually saw that corresponded with this period since about 2008, where the average water temperatures during bull shark pupping season were not really dipping below 24 degrees Celsius. So we were able to kind of accidentally find this threshold temperature that kind of flipped to the bull shark switch on in Pamlico Sound. So this is the kind of information that you want to look at to be able to tell, as climate change is warming ocean waters and changing marine ecosystems, what kind of species might start showing up in those areas. Shifting gears, we'll talk about the species here in our area. So the elasmobranchs, the sharks and rays of Nova Scotia, have a lot of adaptations that allow them to actually live here. As mentioned before, Nova Scotia, both the Scotian Shelf and the Bay of Fundy are unique marine environments. Species need to be able to live well here. A species that does well in the Florida Keys is not necessarily going to thrive in the Bay of Fundy. So the ways that sharks and rays kind of evolved to handle our cold winters and some of our extreme environmental conditions include things like seasonal migrations. So that's a behavioral adaptation. You see sharks showing up during the summer when the water temperatures are a lot more comfortable, and as the water temperatures start to dip, they will head out and go somewhere warmer. You also see some shark species around here with very slow metabolism. So they reduce the energy demands and kind of keep themselves from needing to eat more in times like winter when food might be scarcer, and also from having to burn energy trying to warm themselves up by just feeding less often and growing more slowly. So they're asking their body to do less, and therefore their body is demanding less. With the trade-off being that they're growing very slowly. There are also some species that are capable of warming their body up by themselves. So most sharks are kind of cold-blooded. Their internal body temperature will be fairly close to what the surrounding water is. But some sharks have actually evolved a system where blood from the inner core of the body, where it's been kind of warmed up by muscle movement, is actually brought back to the heart in close proximity to the colder blood that's actually going kind of to the heart and coming from the gills. So what that does is actually kind of warms up the shark's internal body temperature and allows them to actually have basically a warmer body than the surrounding seawater, which allows them to operate more efficiently. A lot of times you see this in things like white sharks, makos, and poor beagles that are very kind of optimized for fast swimming and a very active lifestyle. They're able to maintain that lifestyle in cold water because they do have this ability to warm their bodies up. It's not quite the same as we see in mammals, where mammals are able to maintain a constant body temperature. The shark's body temperature will still kind of vary with the environment, but it is able to keep itself warmer than your average fish or even other shark would be able to. So the rest of this presentation is basically just going through some of the species we can expect to see here in Nova Scotia. Actually, rays are quite well represented in Nova Scotian waters, particularly by the skate species. So these are basically, if you think of a stingray that has a thicker tail but no real stinger, that's a skate. And we have a lot of different species here in Nova Scotia waters. In inshore, very close to shore waters, and especially up in the Bay of Fundy, you will run into species like the little skate and the winter skate. These two can actually be quite hard to tell apart. Winter skates get larger, but when winter skates are smaller, they can actually be tough to tell from little skates. But they can be very common in areas where they occur. They're frequently caught. They're a frequent bycatch in line fisheries. They also show up often in fishing weirs in the Bay of Fundy, and they feed mainly on benthic invertebrates with some fishes. So they kind of root around in the bottom, feeding on invertebrates, but every now and then you do get the odd fish showing up in their stomachs. There are also some other larger and much easier to tell apart skate species that are more out in the oceanic waters. So you'll tend to see these species, while they do occasionally go up into the Bay of Fundy, you tend to see these species more out on the Scotian shelf, and in some cases in quite deep water. The barn door skate is actually, it's called the barn door skate because it's about the size of a barn door when it's fully grown. They're one of the largest skate species in North American waters. And they were previously overfished, but more recent surveys have shown that kind of prohibitions on keeping them when they're caught and other conservation measures are starting to work to rebuild those populations. The thorny skate is another kind of overfished species that's in the process of having its population recover. I believe this species is actually being listed for species or is actually being considered for Species at Risk Act listing as well. These tend to be larger than your winter and little skates, and they also tend to feed on larger prey as such. The barn door skate in particular seems to be really good at actually ambushing fish. You can actually find quite large fishes and in some cases even small sharks in their stomachs. Moving on to the sharks, definitely the most prevalent, if you happen to run into its species here in Nova Scotia waters, is the spiny dogfish. This is a small species. They're born about 18 to 33 centimeters long. They could be up to 1.2 meters in total length. But what they lack in size, they kind of make up for in being just super interesting and also in being highly social. You will see these species all around the Bay of Fundy. You can see them up in Minas Basin. You'll also, traditionally, you'd see them along the South Shore and the continental shelf. I've been hearing that they're a little harder to find out there these days. You do occasionally see them north of Cape Breton and even up to Newfoundland waters. And there actually is an interesting, what they call a sink population in Northumberland Strait between kind of northern Nova Scotia and PEI. That population, as far as people have been able to tell, is not actually reproducing itself, but it does get replenished by occasional adults kind of wandering up there in unusually warm summers. And what these sharks lack in size, they make up for by being extremely social. These are found in schools of hundreds to thousands. This is an aerial photo of a dogfish school. And you can see there's a lot of little sharks there. And it's actually kind of fading down into the shadows on the side. So it's hard to tell actually where that school even ends. They can occur in just absolutely enormous numbers sometimes. I've actually seen dogfish caught in numbers that almost broke a industrial trawl net. They also tend to separate by size and sex very strongly. So you'll typically see adult females close to shore. So if you're running into a spiny dogfish near shore here in Nova Scotia, it's more than likely going to be a mature female. Males and juveniles tend to be farther offshore, although you will see the occasional male kind of come up into the shallows as well. They are yolk sac viviparous. We did see that photo of one kind of swimming around with a little yolk sac on earlier. And they have one of the longest pregnancies in the animal kingdom, with up to 2 years of the young kind of developing in the mother before they're finally born. They have a highly varied diet that shifts over the life stages. So dogfish are actually quite interesting in terms of what they can feed on. When they're younger, they're basically a planktivore. So they're eating things like comb jellies, krill. There are some small fishes, particularly among the newborn to juvenile size ranges. You actually do see these kind of almost planktonic organisms getting slurped up by them. As they grow, and especially when they become the big mature adult females, they actually become highly effective little predators. They feed mostly on fishes. They will also eat things like crabs and cephalopods. So they eat a lot of squid and octopus. And they're actually capable of kind of tearing apart prey larger than themselves. While I was working on their diets off North Carolina, getting my master's degree, we actually found in some individuals chunks of striped bass that had intact scales. And striped bass will lay down growth rings on their scales. And based on those growth rings, we could estimate that the striped bass were actually larger than the sharks that ate them, which was a pretty interesting finding. It didn't happen often, but it definitely happened on more than one occasion. In the same family as the spiny dogfish, actually, is the Greenland shark. And when I told you about the species that really slow their metabolism, this is the absolute poster species for it. So this is an animal that is highly adapted to cold and deep waters. They're born about 40 to 50 centimeters long. They can be huge. They can reach up to 6 meters in total length. You can occasionally find them near shore in very cold waters in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They occur in the Arctic, where they can sometimes be under the sea ice. And then they tend to be offshore and in really deep water further south, and are actually able to follow deep marine environments all the way down to places like the Gulf of Mexico. I think there was one recently that was caught in a really deep set longline, like in the Bahamas. They can be extremely long-lived. So they have that slow metabolism. It's actually thought to be among the slowest of any vertebrate. They don't need to eat that often, so that's one way they have evolved to tolerate these cold temperatures in these deep areas. And it's thought they can live to at least 100 years. There's an extreme estimate of a 400-year lifespan that's from like the absolute highest age estimate from an aging study. But we can reliably assume that they could probably reach at least a century. Also, another large animal that we find here in Nova Scotia waters is the basking shark. They're born 1.5 meters to 2 meters long, and they can be up to 10 meters in total length. And they're essentially a cold water whale shark. They swim around eating plankton and just being huge. And you can find them in the lower Bay of Fundy. They're oftentimes spotted on whale watches that are coming out of the areas down there at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy. You can also see them along the South Shore. There was a dead one that actually washed up kind of between here and Peggy's Cove at one point last summer. Again, mostly planktivores, very cool animals. They mostly move around really slowly, but they are actually capable of breaching out of the water as well. On a more active side, end of the spectrum is the thresher shark. So this shark is well known for its long tail, which makes up half of its body length. So they're born 1.2 to 1.5 meters. They can be up to 5 meters in total length, but again, half of that is tail. They can be fairly common during the summer along the South Shore. People will run into them while they're fishing. There are fishing charters that do catch and release fishing for blue sharks around here that will run into the occasional thresher. And they've also been spotted within the Bay of Fundy as well. They are one of those species that's capable of warming up its own body tissues. So this is a species that's here in our relatively chilly Nova Scotia waters, but still very active. And they use that tail to actually swing around and stun fishes that they then just turn around and eat. And if you ever want to really blow your mind, look up footage of a thresher shark feeding on YouTube. They don't just use the tail to kind of corral fish. They literally can swing the thing around over the top of their heads and hit things that are like right in front of their face. So just a really cool species, also extremely beautiful. They're this cool like cobalt blue color when you see one in real life. We have porbeagles here in Nova Scotia. This is actually one of our more common large shark species. They can reach up to 3.6 meters in total length. Sometimes people call these mini great whites because they look very similar. They are in the same family as the white sharks and the makos. They can be fairly common along the South Shore. Again, mostly in the summer, but you do see them kind of edging into the spring and the fall a little bit more than some of our other species. They feed mostly on schooling fishes, and they are probably the best species in local waters at using that countercurrent heat exchange to warm their bodies. They can get their bodies up into like double digits degrees above the surrounding seawater. We do have the shortfin mako as an occasional visitor to Nova Scotia, especially in the summer. They can be fairly large, over 4 meters in total length. Again, occasional visitor. They're known for being extremely fast. They can burst swim up to 100 kilometers an hour when they're hunting. And if you just look at it, the thing is basically a missile with teeth and fins. They are one of the apex predator species in our local waters. They feed on schooling fishes. They'll go after tuna, swordfish, marlin, other sharks, marine mammals. They will eat the occasional seal or dolphin. They have the unfortunate distinction of being both very fun to catch and also fairly good tasting. So they've been critically endangered by overfishing, and there are a number of fisheries in the North Atlantic that have kind of made them or have made them or in the process of making them a prohibited species in some fisheries. Our most common large shark during the summers is the blue shark. Just an absolutely beautiful animal. There's not really anything else in the world that's more blue than these. They can be fairly large, almost 4 meters in total length. Pretty common along the South Shore in the summer and fall. You can actually find them right outside of Halifax Harbor during the summers. They have an absolutely enormous migratory range that covers the entire North Atlantic, and I'll illustrate that in the next slide. And they're an opportunistic predator that feeds on schooling large fishes. They will eat dogfish and other smaller sharks, and they will take the occasional seal or other marine mammal. To give you an idea of just how extreme their migrations are, on the left is the spring to summer, so the kind of northward migration along the North American East Coast. You see them coming up from the tropics up into Nova Scotia and even as far up as Newfoundland. And then in the fall and winter, some of the individuals that we see here in Nova Scotia cross all the way across the Atlantic into European waters, where they will then kind of migrate down and eventually make their way back up here. You do see really strong separation by size and sex as well. You have to the point where you have males and females, adults and juveniles, almost occupying completely opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And then finally, the celebrity. We have the white shark here in Nova Scotia waters. Born pretty big, it gets pretty big, up to 6.5 meters in total length. One of the largest predatory fish in the modern ocean. As we're getting more data on this species, we're finding that it's a regular visitor to the South Shore, all the way up the Bay of Fundy, including into Minas Basin, sometimes off Cape Breton and in the outer Gulf of St. Lawrence. And we've actually had a few that have washed up pretty far in the Gulf of St. Lawrence within the past year or so. This is one of the apex predators. It's kind of the shark that everybody thinks of when they think of an apex predator shark. They shift from feeding on large fishes and tunas and smaller sharks as juveniles to marine mammals and other sometimes large sharks as adults. They also are capable of using that countercurrent heat exchange system to warm their bodies up. So they are able to operate very efficiently in cooler water. They've made headlines for being increasingly documented in Nova Scotia waters, which raises the question of, is this a range shift? Is climate change bringing these into Nova Scotia waters, or is it just easier to observe them? Not just from the different types of tagging technology, but everybody out on the water at this point has a cell phone, so they can snap a picture and document the sighting. But they have a really interesting history in Nova Scotia waters, and their documented sightings actually go back centuries. Some of the first observations made by Europeans in Nova Scotia included the white shark. And we actually see the same individuals returning to the same areas over multiple years. And a study led by Heather Bowlby over in DFO actually compared white shark, or what's known about white shark population numbers, to the number of tagged individuals that have been showing up. And basically the number of tagged sharks showing up goes up at the same rate as the number of tags that are deployed. So it's more than likely a case of these sharks have just been here for a long time. Maybe we're seeing their numbers rebound from successful conservation measures. But we're mostly seeing them because it's just easier to see them now, thanks to advances in technology. There is an individual celebrity shark here in Nova Scotia, the four-shoe rammer, which some of you may have heard about if you live up in Cape Breton or from Cape Breton. This was a large shark in the 1950s that acted aggressively towards fishing vessels off of several eastern Cape Breton communities, particularly in June and July of 1953. What you see depicted in this painting is actually an attack that it made on a fishing dory off of Four-Shoe, which gave it its name, which actually led to the drowning of one of the crew members of the boat. So this shark literally sank a boat. And they were able to successfully identify the species because they found white shark teeth embedded in the hull when they recovered it. So Nova Scotia does have its own kind of version of Jaws, although it seems to dislike boats more than people. So to kind of wrap things up, the There are other shark species that are probably that are occasionally spotted in Nova Scotia waters. As I mentioned before, there's not really anything stopping some of these larger, highly migratory species from getting up here other than environmental preferences and water currents. One thing we know is that climate change is shifting water currents, it's increasing water temperatures, and what that may end up doing is making the environment off Nova Scotia more comfortable for species that up until now have only been occasionally observed here. So this includes species like the dusky shark, a large carcharodonid that's more common along the U.S. Mid-Atlantic region. We do have a hammerhead that shows up here in Nova Scotia, the smooth hammerhead. Sand tigers have been sighted in the Bay of Fundy. Real tiger sharks have shown up here as well. And smooth dogfish have also been sighted in the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy, even though they're traditionally more of a mid-Atlantic species. So as the waters warm up, we might get some more sharks. And with that, I will happily take any questions if I haven't gone too far over time.
I think one of the participants had a question. They were wondering, how are the blue sharks captured in the mid-Atlantic? I think they were asking that question with regards to like tracking and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, there are a lot of different methods that will actually track blue sharks all the way out to the mid-Atlantic. So for the mercury capture tags, they do get picked up in high seas fisheries for things like tunas and swordfish. So that's how you end up getting tag returns from way out offshore. But also blue sharks are satellite tagged, they're acoustically tagged. So we do get different types of tag technology showing these movements really far offshore and in some cases even crossing the Atlantic Ocean.
Cool. If anybody has any questions, just feel free to like post them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and like turn on the camera. One of the things I found interesting was like, I used to see those mermaid purses when I lived in Newfoundland, but I haven't seen any in Nova Scotia. So I was wondering if you know a spot where I could see those.
I mean, actually, a friend of mine just posted on Instagram that he found mermaids purses somewhere up the eastern shore. I can't remember where exactly he spotted them, but it was not far outside of Halifax. And then you have the little skates and the winter skates that are really prevalent up in the Bay of Fundy. So you might be able to find the occasional mermaid's purse kind of up in some of the upper reaches of the Bay of Fundy as well.
Awesome. Yeah. I used to see them all the time when I was younger.
We see them sometimes in northern Cape Breton, where I am.
Oh, okay.
Awesome.
So maybe I'll have to head up there.
Close to Newfoundland.
Yeah. Very similar too.
There's actually a project in that was started in the UK. I think it's spread to most of Europe at this point, but it's like Project Egg Hunt, I think. And it's they're able to identify different skate species by kind of the shape and the size of the eggs. So they're using that as a way to figure out which species are locally around.
Very cool. Any other questions?
Hi, I had a question. Sorry.
Sure.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Maybe I missed that part, but when we were showing the map with different, I guess, ecozones or environmental zones on the East Coast, where would you say is the highest, I guess, number of species and or abundance of sharks, like overall?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of abundance of sharks, depending on what you're talking about in terms of just like sheer number of individuals, it might be about equal. I mean, we do have a lot of we don't have quite as many species here in the different Nova Scotia ecoregions as you would down in like Florida. But in terms of sheer numbers, we have a lot of dogfish, a lot of blue sharks. So sharks can be quite common depending on which species you're looking at. I would say in terms of diversity of species, it definitely increases as you go further south. You do have some of the cooler water species drop off. You're very unlikely to find spiny dogfish or porbeagles off Florida. But you've got, you know, all the tropical shark species basically starting to show up about there. So yeah, it's in terms of biodiversity, it increases in warmer water, but in terms of sheer numbers, it can be kind of a wash.
Very interesting. Does anybody have anything else to ask, or?
Do the basking sharks migrate some? I'm familiar with them in Scotland. So are they coming up the Gulf with the Gulf Stream up into the Minch in Scotland between the Outer Hebrides and the mainland, or are they going down to the Mediterranean somewhere or off Africa, or do you have any idea?
Basking shark movements are actually really poorly understood. So yeah, the kind of answer to that question is a very unsatisfying maybe. But we, they are highly migratory. People have done some satellite tracking with them. And I want to say there was a photo ID'd individual that was originally, I think it was originally identified off of either Ireland or Scotland, and then showed up off of like Massachusetts, or it might have even been Nova Scotia. It was a wild story. So like at least one seems to have made it from kind of the Irish population over to the Northwest Atlantic population. So yeah, I think there's still a whole lot to be learned about that species.
Thanks.
Yeah, they're definitely super interesting. Yeah, I guess like with that, if nobody else has any questions,
Do we have anything in the chat?
Can I check? Can I ask one more question? Sorry.
yeah, you can ask me.
Sure.
So I really like the part of where you showed the crazy migrations for blue sharks. That was really cool. Like how they cross the Atlantic. That's insane. What's like the longest migration route you've ever seen? Did any individuals cross the Pacific, for example, or something like crazy from like Nova Scotia going to South Africa? Something.
Oh, I mean, yeah, you have in the Pacific, you certainly have some really, really long migrations just by virtue of the Pacific being a larger ocean. Like there's more distance you can cover. I think the blue sharks do have similar migrations in the Pacific, where they cross at least most of the ocean. You also have things like salmon sharks that will occur really close to shore around Alaska, but then migrate way down into like the really middle of the ocean pelagic areas to give birth. The white sharks out there go out to the middle of the ocean. So yeah, like pretty much everywhere you look, if there's a shark species, it's probably doing some kind of crazy migration. Unless you're in Florida and it's a nurse shark, in which case it might just live under the same rock for months.
Thank you.
Very cool. They're all super different too. Yeah, so I mean, with that, thank you so much for the presentation. And we really appreciate you joining us. I'm going to be posting this on YouTube. And thank you to all our participants for joining tonight. There's going to be another nature talk next month, and it's on the Ram's Head lady slipper. If anybody's interested in plants at all, it's kind of my thing. So, but sharks are also amazing. So thank you so much, Charles, and I hope everybody has a good night.
Thanks everybody for coming out.
Thanks. Bye.